There are dire warnings that New South Wales will be hit by increasingly extreme weather.
2015 was the hottest year since climate records began.
Figures show this July was the single hottest month in recorded history.
Australia sweltered through its hottest spring on record.
Climate change is now affecting every country on every continent.
It's the rate that's of great concern.
And what do you put that rate down to?
Oh, it's human activity.
We have everything we need. Some still doubt that we have the will to act, but I say the will to act is itself a renewable resource.
Hello and welcome to Climactic, the flagship podcast of the Climactic Collective, the Trans-Tasman network by and for the climate community. It's week 3 of the lockdown of Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so when having a think about what to feature as this week's episode, I had a look through the output from the collective recently and saw a great episode from James Perrin. Now, James is many things, but he's also a fantastic interviewer and a really, really good podcaster, and we're thrilled that his show, The Overview Effect, is part of the Climactic Collective. So he had a series of live talks that happened back in May of this year at a thing called Renew Fest, which took place in New South Wales. And this is the last one of those talks that he's adapted to his podcast. Now, this one is with David Holmgren, a name familiar to any of you with any exposure to permaculture, most likely. He's the co-originator of the permaculture concept, an author and a thinker, and he's been referenced a few times in other episodes on the collective, of course. But this interview with James takes a very different perspective than most interviews with David, and it's one I especially needed, and I think you will enjoy as well. And that James really zooms out with David and talks about his future scenarios work, where he talks about potential futures and how we can face them. As I record this, the 4th of September, 2021, those futures are feeling much closer to hand than they probably felt in May of this year, or definitely any time in 2019. So this is a great listen. It comes in at just under an hour. It's the perfect accompaniment for your daily walk. So get out there in your suburb, look around, listen to this chat with David Holmgren, and think about what your suburb or area, the street you live on, what it could look like in the future. Enjoy.
Hello again, friends. Welcome back to the Overview Effect with James Perrin, the podcast about having big, bold, philosophical conversations with incredible, inspiring people about not just what they do, but why they do it and how they see the world and the moments that have shaped them. I'm your host, James Perrin. I want to acknowledge that today's episode was recorded on a Rockwell country in Bundjalung Nation. I want to pay respects to members, elders of the Bundjalung community and all First Nations people around Australia and around the world. Now, I have an absolute treat of an episode for you today. Today, I've got the final live conversation from Renew Fest in Mullumbimby back in May, and it's with an absolute gem of a human, a living legend, esteemed author, thinker, and co-originator of the permaculture concept, David Holmgren. Now, we've all heard of permaculture. It's been a massive movement all around the world. So many people have taken on the concepts of permaculture design into their homes and their gardens. And so rather than just talk with David around what is permaculture and how do we implement it, I wanted to take the opportunity to step back and have a bigger conversation. We start by talking about, where did permaculture come from? Why did you feel like you needed to develop it? And truly, he shares that it was birthed from his perspectives on what the future could look like and the challenges that we may or very likely will face as society, and what actions and behaviours we then need to cultivate now to change our trajectory. So in this conversation, we dive into a whole nother body of work David has done, which he calls future scenarios, and he outlines and shares these potential future scenarios that we could be facing and the challenges that come with them. We also talk about, in the face of global over-reliance on centralized corporations and governments, we've outsourced so many of our services. We talk about the need, the importance of cultivating both self-reliance, that is taking things into our own hands, as well as collective reliance, that is building authentic, genuine, purposeful community connections. And then finally, we dive into a lot of the content around his most recent book, which is a few years old now, called Retro Suburbia, A Downshifter's Guide to a Resilient Future. This is an incredible book. It is a manuscript on not just what we can do, but how we should be living. I cannot recommend it highly enough. He is a rare mix of highly intellectual as well as just genuinely human and down to earth. I think you're going to love this one, and the live crowd at RenewFest just adds a whole nother dimension to the atmosphere. So please enjoy this conversation live from RenewFest with none other than David Holmgren. Let's just wing it, shall we?
Yeah, okay.
Hello, everybody. By quick way of background, my name's James. I'm very grateful to be partnering with RenewFest for some of these conversations. And is that for me? Oh, thank you. How good is that?
I've got that.
You got the shade. I'm here boiling, sweating in the sun. We should swap. I'm interviewing you. You need to be sweating in the hot seat. Just by a quick way of background, so I'm a sustainability engineer and chemical and environmental engineer and sustainability manager, but I've also been running this podcast for the last 9 or so months called The Overview Effect, which is based on this concept, this premise, this experience that astronauts have when they first go up into space and they look back on Earth for the first time and they see our world at a distance and they see how fragile and beautiful and how amazing it is, and they feel this overwhelming sense of connection and emotion to our world and the beings that inhabit it. So that's kind of the premise, to explore big picture conversations with environmentalists and humanitarians, and I'm very grateful to be able to sit next to another amazing guest today. So he really needs no introduction, but I'm going to do one anyway. So David Holmgren is obviously very well known as one of the co-originators of permaculture. And as well as being a practitioner and teacher of permaculture, he is also a very well-credentialed author and philosopher. He's written books such as Permaculture, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, Future Scenarios, How Communities Can Adapt to Peak Oil and Climate Change, and his most recent one, which was written 3 years ago, which, just like all of his books, seems to become more relevant every year, and it's a bit weighty because it's part manifesto and part manual, but Retro Suburbia, A Downshifter's Guide to the Resilient Future. Please join me in welcoming David Holmgren.
Thanks, James, and thanks to Luke and Ella and all the other incredible volunteers that have put this together, and to be part of it after these years that it's now a lineage here. And for me, this is really one of 5 visits to the subtropics in my life. So they're all sort of formative experiences, I think, including the first one when I was here in the aftermath of the Aquarius Festival in 1973, which was one of those influences on what became permaculture, maybe.
Oh yeah, that would have been a good one. I'd love to start by hearing some of your stories, or if you have a story for us. So thinking about that overview effect that I just introduced, and those moments where we have those kind of paradigm shifts in the way that we see and interact with the world. Have you had a moment or an experience or a period of time that's really shaped your perspective on how you view and interact with our world?
Yeah, it's those sort of questions. I've always said, no, I'm sort of like an incrementalist, keep sort of adding another little bit, and then there's never been that aha moment where the vision has come through in some crystal clarity. But I suppose when I look back, obviously like perhaps most people, those formative years of youth, that I would say, especially from age 17 through to mid-20s, I can't believe how much happened in that short time. And of course, for me, there was a period there living and working and thinking and arguing and gardening with Bill Mollison for about 18 months, in which I wrote the permaculture manuscript, which became the basis of Permaculture 1, that is a sort of a formative moment in time when we look back from the point of view of being in our mid-60s. But if I sort of trace that back a little bit earlier, I think as a kid, I was what would be called a super rationalist. I pulled apart clocks to see what made them tick. I was the proto-scientist, but also the kinesthetic kid who did stuff, broke things, built things. Oh, the speaker's gone?
There we go.
Oh, right. Oh, right. Okay, so, and so super rationalist that I would edit out my dreams because I couldn't make sense of the dream world. And then through a pathway of that rational, ideological discovery of key moments, in trying to find a pathway to be rebellious from my radical parents, I had to find something that was outside their field of reference, and it turned out to be the ideology of the politics of ecstasy, courtesy of Timothy Leary and co. And, so I had this ideology at 16 that there was all these drugs in society that were depressing consciousness, but the potential of the mind-enhancing drugs was an ideology before I'd ever smoked a joint. So, yeah, very much in the head. And that led to formative experience with 5 managed LSD trips at 17 in my final year of school, when I was dux of the school, the highest academic award. And I think the final of those experiences shattered forever the idea that we could fully understand the complexity of the mind, the outer world, and I look back and see that was a formative experience in opening me not just at a intellectual level, but a heart and body level to all of the complexity we see that we relate to the earth, even though that was actually the last LSD trip I ever had.
Wow.
So maybe that was one of those formative moments.
Maybe it was. And, that wouldn't... You wouldn't be the first person to say that an experience with LSD has had that formative moment for you, or has given someone that kind of overview effect or that paradigm shift. And what a wonderful trip that was, because it gave us permaculture. Eventually. Hopefully.
There was a lot of other seeds in the pathway, obviously.
Well, you're very well known, obviously, for permaculture, which I think a lot of people, perhaps not everyone here, but maybe perhaps people that kind of hear it on the margins or at surface level think that it's a fancy form of gardening. But your work is deeply rooted in exploring, and it really comes from exploring the key challenges of our time. And you've written a lot, and you've written and spoken a lot on things like the concept of energy descent and these big challenges. In fact, the first whole chapter of Retro Suburbia is framing up these key challenges of our time. I think it's important to go there and explore that and acknowledge what these key challenges that we currently face are. So could you take us there, perhaps some of those 3 key challenges that you talk about in the book, or what you are referring to when you talk about energy descent?
That's a dangerous question. That's sort of like asking me, invitation to get up on the, if not the soapbox, then the lectern, and give a sort of a continuous 1 week dissertation.
Well, oh no,
But-
yeah. Can you do it in just like a few minutes? That would be great.
Yeah, the elevator pitch. I suppose it's important to recognise that permaculture was informed by a dark view of the state of the world and future possibilities, but was focused around the positive things that can be involved in transformative change. And it started with agriculture as the prime activity on the planet by humans by which we get our most important material needs met. Primarily what a lot of us are doing here right at the moment, which defines us as animals. I can see quite a few animals out there eating food. You know, how does that come about? Agriculture in some form or another, including gardening. So from the beginning, from a deep systems ecological perspective, we saw food and agriculture as the most central issue. And of course, permaculture spread into popular culture or exploded into popular culture in the late 70s as a cool form of organic gardening, sheet mulching. So much so that people thought permaculture was sheet mulching. It was really difficult to sort of push away these successes to say, well, that's just one technique which is suitable and appropriate in some places but may not be in others. So I suppose moving on into the 90s, I saw a lot of the techno-optimistic green tech future stuff still seemed to me framing around how to end up searching for solutions and partly finding those solutions and then turning the solutions back into the same old problems. And the deeper foundations for what was called sustainability and in permaculture needed to be articulated more strongly. And so my book, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, and the distilling that around a distillation of permaculture design principles, which has since sort of reinvigorated the teaching of permaculture as a deep concept of resilience, regeneration, and that now slightly tired word, sustainability, which is problematic.
Yeah. We started with sustainability, we moved to resilience, and now we're very much in the regeneration phase of the terminology, I think.
Gee, words don't have a very long life, do they? They get used and disposed of. Do we have a word recycling system that we can, to be politically incorrect, disabled people come back, or what was the ones before that again? Oh no, that's no longer acceptable, or this. I can remember a letter to the newspaper locally that described the willow trees round Lake Dalesford as a pristine wilderness that shouldn't be damaged. And then someone else writing to the paper the previous week that had said it's a bloody wilderness that needs to be cleaned up. And I thought, isn't that interesting? In the same community, two people using a word in English that with two opposite meanings simultaneously about the same issue. Do we actually even have a language that we can talk to each other?
I get what you're talking about there, like recycling words. Maybe it's like a word compost. It's like a word composting system, and then we can... you mentioned before you said what you call your green tech scenario, and maybe we can just cover that for a minute, because you've done a lot of work in your future scenarios work, which is really about exploring the different potential futures we face. You know, it's not just maybe what we hear on the news and the media that this is going to happen and that's what we need to prepare for. When I've kind of explored your work there, you've gone, well, let's look at the uncertainties of the impact of climate change and whether that's going to be more than what we think or maybe not as much as we think, and the uncertainties of the impact of the decline in oil. And whether that's going to be a slow descent or a very quick, sudden drop-off. And then from that, you basically end up with 4 quadrants, right? Or 4 scenarios. Can you explain what those scenarios are to you and how that's shaped your thinking?
I know you tried to ask me that question, and I sort of... I went back and built a few foundations, but now...
Now we're ready.
Okay, so firstly, the framework for thinking about futures other than the normally projected ones is to see those in 4 possible long-term future scenarios. The first I call techno-explosion, which is, we're all going to Mars with Elon Musk, etc. This has been around for a long time. I was fed it, not so much by my parents, but by the boys' magazines. Well, whether that's an emergent possibility, it depends, in my view, that there is, and it can be manifest very quickly, a greater source of net energy to support humanity, or whatever humanity ends up turning itself into, than what we've had from fossil fuels. Now, of course, people like Elon Musk actually believe that renewable energy like solar and whatever is that, and they're off on that trajectory. That's been there for a long time. The second possibility I call techno-stability, and that's the idea that we're going to restructure our society away from a need for perpetual material growth, reform the monetary systems, deal with geopolitical conflict, and use a rapid shift to renewable energy to create a steady state. Now, a lot of people don't realise where that that techno-stability view came from, but it's the default one that mainstream environmental organisations and a huge increasing proportion of people say, yeah, that's where we are heading, and that's where we could be heading, and that's where we should be heading. The third I call energy descent, where there's a reduction in, on average, around the world over centuries in the net energy and resource base to support future generations, which requires a simplification and a re-ruralisation, a relocalisation of all of our basic functions over some period of time. And the fourth scenario is I call collapse. And I don't mean just the collapse of the stock market or the suburban way of life. I mean the unravelling, continuous spiral unravelling that happened like to the Minoan civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Mayan civilization in Central America. The decline of the Roman Empire was energy descent. Very well documented. That's sort of a model of what I thought was actually the most likely future for global society. So because that's almost not looked at, people look at techno-explosion and then say, if that's not going to work, it's going to be collapse. This is millennialism. We're going to heaven or we're going to hell.
And I think what I'm
so looking at all my energy descent scenarios are fleshing out that and then using that framework to look at different variations of that.
Yeah, and what I was going to say and what I'm hearing in that is it's not about then looking at those scenarios and going, I think it's going to be that one, and let's aim for that, or let's do what we need to do in that scenario. It's actually kind of stepping back and going, okay, well, what ways of being will serve us best in all, regardless of which scenario plays out? What do we need to set up now so that we are able to adapt or that we are ready for any of these scenarios?
The thing that I've done is broken one of the rules of scenario planning. In terms of those 4 big scenarios I've talked about, because energy descent it's not part of the consciousness, I said, let's look at that. Because permaculture was predicated from the beginning that that's going to happen in some form or another. Now, if it doesn't happen, then permaculture will be reduced to some sort of subculture of people or their evolutionary parts that emerge from humanity as a little sort of enclave, like my Jewish ancestors in the ghettos of European Christendom, maintaining to their their world out of a value structure while the rest of the world moves on. Because I believe very strongly that while human ideas and energy contribute to creating the world, when you look back from the big ecological perspective, it's the underlying energy and resource base that nature bats last. Nature determines what we can be. And the limits of nature, whether that's the renewability of does nature work, do trees grow, those cycles, or the things you discover in holes in the ground that have created this huge explosion of what we treat now as normality, they all came from nature. You know, they didn't come out of humans being smart. That's one of the delusions of the urban mind, that in European civilization got disconnected from its sources of subsistence when they discovered two continents of free resources where 90% of the people died at contact in the Americas. And they didn't understand how much it was that was creating the new mercantile capitalism and all of the world we currently assume. See, I told you not to ask me questions like...
Because here I am listening and I'm going, okay, how can I segue this? No. Well, I mean, one thing that jumps out to me in all of your scenarios and in all of your work and everything that you're talking about is this... in all of those scenarios, whether it's the green tech, you know, Elon Musk will save us and let's put all our eggs in that basket, or whether it's the renewable future and renewable technology will save us and let's put all of our eggs in that basket, or whatever it is, the government will look after us. For me,
flexibility.
It's flexibility, and also stepping out of our reliance on external people, organisations, governments, corporations. I love how you refer to three must completely be artificial corporations in moles, bullies and cunnings that you refer to in your work. But how much of these issues that we face do you think are just our complete reliance on these centralised systems?
Yeah, look, the understanding the big picture is only useful for some people who need that strategic larger scale map. And for me, the future scenarios work was to help permaculture and kindred activists who are sort of trying to think about those things, be a little better informed and aware of what might be coming over the horizon or whatever. But the real important stuff to do is the grounded, get connected to your sources of sustenance, get connected to what are the relationships in real, achievable, both network and geographic place-based community, and take back the power that we have lost by doing things for ourselves. So it's self-reliance and collective reliance at the household and community scale. The other thing about that is that it's a moral imperative. If you've got weird ideas about society should be organised completely different from this way, which is completely normal, isn't it, without any historical reference, then we should be the guinea pigs to see if we can make that work for one person or one household, or dare I say one intentional community or one school community, before we say, well, society should make these big reforms at the top because we've got this really good idea. No, do it ourselves. Be the guinea pigs. See if we can make it work at that scale.
Hell yeah. And in that, I love how you said self-reliance and collective reliance, because I've certainly had the moments in my life where I've thought, screw this, I need to go and buy a bush block and set myself up off-grid and cut myself off so that I'm self-sufficient. But and perhaps maybe that's, some people who haven't understood permaculture and the work where that's come from have gone to. Whereas what you're talking about is, no, it's very important to take your matters into your own hands and be self-reliant, but just as important are those community, those place-based connections. And really, for me, that's what a big part of this is about, right? It's how do you connect with those around you and build a reliant, appropriately sized, reliant community and collective.
Yeah, I want to answer that in a couple of ways. I first want to, in a form of pushback, acknowledge the ratbag individualists who went out as do-it-yourself, try and do everything in a sort of an extended form of adolescence or even childhood, where we try everything and through that we find what we're actually good at. So we all built our own houses, we all grew our own food, tried to design water systems and etc. Not just in the physical stuff, but tried to create businesses with new forms of operational rules and new forms of financing and everything. Redesign everything from scratch. It's a hard call, but it's also what in the Transition Towns network is called the Great Reskilling. There is a need for a whole lot of people to get grounded and get practical and become useful people. And, we still have a chronic shortage of competent food producers in this country. Sure, not everyone needs to grow their own food, but you need to be connected and rewarding someone who is a competent food producer. In fact, multiple competent food producers. Because we do actually have a lot of people who can design new software. We do have actually a lot of people who are great with communications technology. And although I totally support what a lot of people call social permaculture, who say, look, we know what all the physical design things are, but can we get it together as people? That's the weak link. Very true. But I cringe when they say, we know what all the solutions are. If that was the case, why don't we have suburban gardens that are generating this huge surplus of food, which is triggering young children who are becoming, commercial gardeners? Why don't we have all of these spontaneous processes where we're generating all our own energy, not just from things manufactured in clean room manufacturing in China, but from what we have around us? We don't have our act together at a lot of the basic levels. So that's the first thing. And that the people who have those skills should have, instead of being at the bottom, should be elevated as having status. And that's one of the great things about farmers markets and community-supported agriculture, this elevation of the status of people who produce food. So it's not an anti-intellectual thing, it's not an anti-technology thing, it's a strategic thing, is what are we really missing? And in this country we've got a lot of capacities at those high levels. Yes, we need to redirect those, and maybe I could point to someone in this community who's been brilliant at doing that, who have been staying with Mitra Ardran there in terms of facilitating how do we get these processes to happen through entrepreneurial networks and etc. But there is a deep importance in that basics. Accepting that, then yes, the community level, we can't do everything. And especially as we get a bit older, we we find we actually can do less. So the other critique there that my retro suburbia work says is that seeing this long lineage of there's the individual and then there's community. And a lot of the great activists have actually been individuals who maybe live with a partner or a family or a household, but they're really gregarious and they like lots of people around and they even like going to meetings and they, connect with people and they go, yeah, we need to do it at the community level. And that somehow that word, the household, where all of us live in some form of household, is either taken for granted that that's all together, or it's actually not useful, or it actually belongs to the social conservatives who want to return everything to the 1950s. The household in Australia and similar societies is the weakest link in the chain. And that's one of the strategic reasons why my retro suburbia work actually focuses on that. And I use the term household rather than family because it may or may not be a traditional family, it may be an extended family, but we know throughout history that people suffering tougher, more challenging times, whatever form that comes in, reconsolidate in larger households. Most commonly extended family households. And hey, we've got the smallest households that have ever existed in history. We're we've been trending down towards one-person households. And hey, it's really hard to be resilient, regenerative, and sustainable as one-person households.
And your Aussie Street story tells that really well. I love how storytelling is so important to create those examples and those stories for us to grasp these concepts. And and it's another thing in this book, but I know you've written about it in children's books and done other talks on this concept or this story of Aussie Street. But perhaps you can take us through that a little bit. It takes us through the decades and looks at things like square meterage per person. I'll let you take it away.
Well, look, it's a permaculture soap opera, from starting in the Dick Copeman, Northern Street City Farm, introduced an early version of it that I gave to an audience of 300 people in a hall in Brisbane in 2006 on a round Australia speaking tour with Richard Heinberg, where he was giving the bad news about peak oil and I was giving the good news about permaculture, instead of a whole lot of evidence and whatever, through my Aussie Street story. And so it traces these 4 houses and households from the 1950s through up into the 2000s when the feral permaculture retrofit starts at number 2 and spreads to number 3, while life drifts on at number 1, and at number 4 it's been hardened down with infill development in the backyard and everything concreted over, and tenants who don't know their neighbours and don't know the owner who they only deal with through the real estate agent. So for many years that was just left as how can this process that started at number 2 and number 3 in Aussie Street spread and colonise the more difficult psychosocial and biophysical territory of number 1 and number 4. And I left that as an open question, and then it morphed into the next part of the story of the Second Great Depression in Australia and how the people in Aussie Street survive and thrive through really challenging shit that happens. And I found that storytelling was a much better way to deal with really challenging issues than giving people a whole lot of facts. But it was also me laughing back and poking fun at academics to say, why don't you go out and study what actually is happening in our residential heartlands and hinterlands where most Australians live? Because after 1975, there was no serious academic study of what Australians do in their backyards or do at home at all, until 2005, where suddenly there was a whole lot of new focus on that. And books like Harvest of the Suburbs by Andrea Gaynor, some of the first academic work looking at the history of backyard food production. So it was like we are completely ignorant about what people do, let alone what they could be doing. So I was doing a meta-analysis of Aussie Street showing how many square metres per person there are in the various decades, what are greenhouse gas emissions, how many hours of occupancy is there, how much people are away, to sort of pull the rug from out under the feet of one of the ideas that I think has been so toxic and wrong that environmentalism has got on board with, which is the idea of densification, infill development to make our cities more efficient. And on top of that, I've been saying we don't need to build any more buildings. We've got enough. We just need to work out how to use them, share them, retrofit them for useful purposes. The pandemic has shown that maybe half the economy is completely unnecessary anyway. The gymnasia, the dog shampoo services, 90% of the cafes and whatever. It's tragic, of course, that most of those are owned by small businesses, and the really important stuff of the essential economy is dominated by corporations like moles and bullies. But the Aussie Street story was a way to sort of raise awareness. So I had a meta-analysis. I actually did a PhD on Aussie Street. But Aussie Street is a complete fabrication. It's just a story.
It paints such a good picture, though. And the thing that I really love about it is that, one, we're not starting from we've got to throw out everything and start clean slate and redesign from scratch. It's a retrofit of our existing situation we find ourselves in. And two, there's that ripple effect. I think Ollie and Ali that went in at number 2, and that started to flow over to the backyard of number 3. And then in the next decade, one of the daughters started to put a goat in the backyard of the elderly neighbours at number 1. And it just painted this really wonderful picture about that ripple effect, or, you could even say like that kind of morphic resonance theory of how what you do actually can very much contribute and play a role with what other people do and how it influences other actions over time.
Well, my last visit to Mullumbimby and went to Sharon Gibson's place, and there's actually a little photo in Retro Suburbia book of her place here in Mullumbimby. And coming back, apart from how much further she had taken the whole Retro Suburbia journey in her backyard, the first thing I noticed when I got there was these verge gardens in the place next door. And new owners there were doing their version of Retro Suburbia. So, these creative ways in which the message spreads. I wonder how many people here, I think, unless my memory's wrong, my last visit to Mullum, I actually did a presentation of Aussie Street, a version of Aussie Street in the Civic Centre here. But I can't remember whether it was the old clinky PowerPoint version or the upstaged version, which I'm about to do tomorrow night. I'm really rusty at Aussie Street. At Coffs Harbour, supported by the local government there. So most of the presentations since the book have actually been supported by local government sustainability programs to audiences of between 30 and 300.
Have you found that, especially in the last year, but really since the book, there's been a renewed sense of and support and interest from local government? So, I'm just thinking, we face this housing crisis here. The crisis here is ridiculous. We've got the most expensive real estate in the country, and we've got this enormous tourism, Airbnb situation where people who have lived here for decades now struggling to find places to live. Do you think that all of those issues that we face are you're finding renewed sense of a lot of this work and support of this work?
Yeah, a bit, but it is difficult without there being a whole framework of there's the academics that have done all the research and evidence, and they're talking about it to their students for years and decades, and then they filter into government, and these ideas get thrashed around at a policy level, and then the state government, someone sort of says, oh yeah, we could do a bit of that, and they put some framework together and feed that down to local government and say, you could do this because there's an evidence base that this will address this and this issue.
Meanwhile, through all that time comes the opportunity for businesses and corporations to influence that policy before it filters down as well.
Yeah, and so when you start talking about just the household and community non-monetary economy, and people, I've never heard that term. Is that part of the discourse? Or when get more deliberate with sustainability officers or mayors of saying, what is the greatest thing you could do? You could have a support program to encourage people to take in a border into their houses. Where can they go back into their sustainability stuff, which will say, yeah, that will tick all these boxes? Where's the evidence base that, larger households are actually more energetically efficient, so there'll actually be less greenhouse gas emissions? Where's the evidence base that this will lead to greater community development and less crime because there's more casual eyes on the street? And the trouble is, a lot of that evidence base, if it was there, would also show that these activities will reduce GDP and that therefore they're economic treason. So in some ways, the ambiguous, just people doing things under the radar, and I mean like sustainability officers who can say, well, we can support this retro suburbia thing because, yeah, it ticks this box, this box, this box, and the people above them go, oh, yeah, okay, we'll do a little bit. And you try and get in the top end and you'll say, no, you will be cut out seriously because this is economic treason, and it's meant to be economic treason to pull the power back out of those corporations. Now, people would say, how could taking in a border, contribute to doing that? That's such a sort of pathetic little thing. Now, that's just one strategy, but I think gradually there is more people having a sense of that, and our main focus was to empower the people who are already living this way to do it better and create a new normal, not in the sense of a majority of people living like this, but just enough people where kids can go to another house and, oh yeah, that's like what we do at home. Or, you don't need many people to create a new normal, especially for children. And so the Our Street Kids book, which is my Aussie Street adult story, which is very adult in some of its elements, maybe even politically incorrect. There's the Our Street version, which is told from the point of view of the kids in the street. Now, I have to let you know, as a publisher, kids' illustrated children's books are not economic. Like they all have subsidies. They all are funded. Ours isn't, and we did it even though the spreadsheet said this way will never make a profit. Because we just want it even there, if it's for the kids who are living this life, that they can see themselves in the story, then that's good enough. The really good thing would be if that could slide into all the environmental education programs at schools and seed a kids-led revolution in suburbia. If we could achieve that, and if any of you are teachers or know the networks to actually see if that book suited a program, then we're really interested in doing that because it would help us financially, and we believe it would be this amazing ability to see change from the bottom up, from the kids.
Hear, hear. It's a wonderful point you make. It's such a good point you make about the contrast between we need to tick the sustainability box versus what just feels like the right thing to do on a common sense normal everyday person level. The example, if we keep with that housing example, the example that sticks out in my mind is that we could build a 6 green Energy Star house with all the LEDs and the permaculture garden and everything, and we could talk about how sustainable it is and how eco-efficient it is, or we could just house those 2 people in existing houses. And because we have the highest floor space ratio in the world, I think, here in Australia. Is that right?
Yeah. I think it was about 2005, our average house size became the largest in the world. But that's only the tip of the iceberg, because people are hardly ever at those houses, because they're both out on the mouse wheel paying the debt for the enormous imaginary value of it's not even the house. Your house is worth nothing. Forget it. It's the land under it that just keeps rising according to a law of anti-gravity up into the stratosphere of finance. So that means you don't have to use your house. Its use value is irrelevant. So apart from being out paying for it, you're then so stressed from the job you're doing, which may be what I think it was Dutch economists who classified a huge proportion of the jobs in the world as bullshit jobs. Bullshit in the sense that the people doing them even thought that those jobs were useless to society. But then you're so stressed by that, or even doing what you think is halfway useful work, that you then need your consumer rewards. So you're going out to the restaurant at night instead of cooking food at home, and you're going to the gym, and you've got this consumption lifestyle where you're actually never at home. But meanwhile, the empty house is going up in value all the time, isn't it? It doesn't need to be used. So it's actually not occupied, and it's this hours of occupancy. So where are all those people? They're out moving to and from other partly used buildings, creating a sense of crowding in our cities, which leads to grumpy old Aussies saying it's all the bloody migrants coming in that are making our cities crowded and unaffordable. It's just that everyone's out moving around. There's actually no more people than was in a lot of those cities per hectare than there were in my childhood.
And that to me speaks to, you roughly break down the following elements of the book to built and all the things around how to, sustainably build houses and all that other good stuff. Biological, and largely around, the gardens and the water and the setup and the interaction with our environment. But that, what you're talking to, largely speaks to that third one, which is behavioural. And that really feels like the one we haven't cracked.
Yeah, and we tried to pull together the threads from our own experience in that. And at the household level, my biggest influence in that is really behind a lot of that work and the ideas, really my partner, Sue Dennett. And yeah, some of those ideas are sort of quite controversial, but they're also distilled out of the learnings of the intentional communities movement and all sorts of great efforts that people have made of how do we share, how do we live together, and also dealing with the big tough issues of finance and debt, raising self-reliant and resilient children, sustainable and sustaining diet. God, there's a controversial one. Aging, disability and death. So we tackle all the hard issues without necessarily answers, but markers as some of the templates of what people have tried in this ilk. And Sue says, I'd start at the back of the book with the behavioural.
Yeah.
It's really 3 books in one, in a way.
It totally is. And I guess so on that, to carry that forward, I mean, people can go read the book and obviously explore your work, but if you could give us some, what can we do? As we've got this beautiful gathering here, we've got all these amazing progressive minds, what a beautiful festival for us to gather and congregate and have these big picture conversations. So then when we go home to our houses this evening, to our homes, what can we do? What are the practical and things that we should all be working towards?
It's very difficult to answer that question because every one of us is in a different situation. And doing an audit, a personal and household audit of, okay, where do our needs come from? You know, how are they supplied? All of that. And that may lead to things like, I think I need to move to where my kids and grandkids are living, or maybe I should go back to the family property and resolve those conflicts with my cranky parents and see if they'll let me build a tiny house down the back. And if it's mobile, I can always, you know, go somewhere else, or, you know, like, and I don't want to sort of like, anything you choose to say is, you know, completely irrelevant to some people you're saying it to. You know, it may be, I need to grow some food, you know, or I need to exchange something with that person across the street that I have this sort of say hello relationship to, but I have a sense that they have part of the puzzle. Look, I would want to segue slightly from retro suburbia back to future scenarios, but via the pathway of storytelling. And apart from the Our Street Kids book, which is obviously storytelling, the publication that we did just before that is by permaculture author Linda Woodrow, who wrote the book Permaculture Home Garden, one of the best-selling permaculture books in Australia. And beginning of last year, she sent us a manuscript, a very complete manuscript of her story. And we said, in a fit of impulse, having never published a novel, let alone tried to sell it, published that book, 470. We don't have any copies over there at the moment. How many people have read the book 470? I would be really interested in honest feedback of whether people in this region where that book is set as climate-driven catastrophes happening about 10 years into the future from now, given the aftermath of the bushfires, the floods, the pandemic, and given the history of what this region has had in terms of resilience and whatever, whether if 10% of the population in this region read that book, whether that would trigger runaway conversations, discussions, actions that might be another seed of something happening. Now, obviously, I have an established interest in this because we want to sell that book. But I think it just struck me being here, you know, going down to Byron, being in this the Mullum market and being up in the back hills, you know, because Linda's intimate knowledge of all this territory and the social territory has, I think it's a great read. But maybe that's just because I'm sort of projecting that into it. But that's a sort of an example of something people could do and see if it triggers those discussions.
I think what I'm hearing from you, which is exactly right, it's like not give me your top 10 tips on how to raise veggies or do this in the backyard. It's actually, okay, where do we go to learn more, and actually what type of conversations do we need to have?
I'd point to people like Sharon Gibson. Don't ask me. This is the foreign subtropics. I don't know anything about that.
But it's not what do we need to do, it's actually how do we need to be, and what kind of conversations do we need to have, and how do we need to reflect on ourselves and our experience and who we are and how we interact. And I think that's about it for time, but I will say David and Sue are here. If you haven't seen their stall, you can go and have a chat, and they've got books on sale. There's a few of their books in the library. This one's in the library. I think there's a couple. In the interest of a sharing economy, you can go and rent one, but that's one of them. So, and I rarely return my books on time, so good luck waiting for that one.
Can I just say that it's available online
Yes.
as a flip book on a pay-what-you-feel basis. And that another 7,000 or 8,000 people have access. That we do think that a lot of people did that and they said, "No, I'll go and get the real physical book." But we did that in a response to the pandemic. So it is available to everyone if they want.
Yeah, wow. Wonderful. Well, please, ladies and gentlemen, a living legend, can you join me in thanking David Holmgren? All right. I think that's us.
The Climactic Collective.